Sam. What are you doing, buddy?
I'm trying to read your mind.
Okay. What am I thinking?
You want to talk about the Telepathy Tapes? Welcome to Podcast Cast. Hello and welcome to Podcast Cast. It's a podcast where we talk about podcasts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Honor.
Honor, I love it. That was beautiful. It was musical. It felt like you were releasing your debut 2010 pop album.
And I am. I'm making that album right now.
15 years later.
Yeah.
It's your 2010 pop album.
Yep.
Honor, this is a big book club for us.
Yeah.
Because I think we're tackling a podcast unlike any other podcast that we've ever talked about. And I think, honestly, different than any other podcast ever made.
Yeah. It's kicked Joe Rogan out of number one.
It's not. Well, it was at the top show charts for a while, but it isn't anymore. I mean, it did
that.
Yeah.
It kicked Joe Rogan
for a
out,
time. Yes.
which is impressive anytime anything does that.
That's true. It's still a very popular podcast and still at some of the, at least on Apple Podcasts where I consume my podcast, it's at the top of the charts.
Yeah.
But it's not the top.
Yeah. But it has done it.
It's very crazy. We are talking about the Telepathy Tapes. The Telepathy Tapes is Honor, how would you describe it? Like, what genre would you give it? I think one might say investigative journalism or perhaps even a documentary podcast.
Yeah, I would say either of those. Unless is it still investigative journalism and or documentary if you believe it is pseudoscience and or not true at all? Yeah.
Well, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good question because the premise of this podcast, which I frankly have not said out loud enough, the premise of this podcast is that nonverbal autistic people have supernatural abilities, namely the ability to read other people's minds.
Which is called telepathy.
And it's a cute little name.
For the tapes.
Yeah, it's a crazy, crazy premise. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of crazy podcasts out there. I'm not under any delusion that podcasting is this holy sanctuary of truth and Ira Glass.
What? That's all there is. Ira Glass does every podcast.
I have listened to other podcasts very briefly. They'd be like, what is this nonsense? That's conspiracy theory stuff or whatever. But what's different about this podcast is that it has had such a wide audience and that so many people have listened to it. And the reason that happened, so the Telepathy Tapes, I think, started coming out in September, but it didn't get really popular till the end of 2024. When Joe Rogan happened to give it a little shout out on his podcast. He was talking to some guest and he was like, hey, you heard about the Telepathy Tapes? And then guest was like, no, what is that? And he's like, it's a tape and they're talking about people reading minds. It's crazy. Do you like my Joe Rogan impression? It's spot on.
Nothing. You mean?
Hey, it's me, Joe Rogan. Hi, guys. Welcome to my podcast.
Hi, guys.
And then after Joe Rogan gave it a shout out, it really blew up and became a lot more popular. Or at least a lot more people knew about it. So I saw it on the top charts, and I was like, I should give this a listen. Holy moly, what's happening? And then I finished it, then Honors listened to it. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go through, I want to go through the plot. That might be a good...
I mean, the overview.
Yeah, well, just what happens, the story that they tell. And then I'm going to go over it. Honor, if you think I'm forgetting anything because you've listened to it more recently, jump in. And I think we'll just talk about it as we go through it. Because if this isn't apparent, this podcast is crazy. Mm-hmm. And I really want to loop back to that at the end of the show and we're going to talk about a lot of crazy things. Mm-hmm. And then I want to talk about how crazy it is at the end. So,
okay. So we'll just talk about how crazy it is the whole time.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
So firstly, this is a podcast by Kai Dickens. Kai is a documentarian. That's what she does. She makes other documentaries, I don't know. I haven't seen any other documentaries that she makes, so I don't really know anything else about that, but I know that that's what her job is. The story of this podcast for her, and she's kind of suffered some personal tragedy in her life. I forget exactly what happened. I think her dad might have passed away, and so she kind of goes on this soul-searching period of her life, right? And while she's doing that, she's listening to this podcast, I forget which is about kind of exploring, I don't know, extra spirituality kind of stuff, kind of that modern agey, you know, like what's really out there in the world, you know, kind of meditations and crystals kind of stuff. And on that show, on that podcast, she hears from Dr. Diane Powell. Dr. Diane Powell is a former psychiatrist, so an MD, who is researching privately and believes that there are humans that have telepathy, namely nonverbal autistic people. That's the group we're talking about here. Is people with autism that like don't speak or have really limited abilities to speak.
Yeah.
So Kai hears about Dr. Powell, and then she reaches out to Dr. Powell she wants to learn more about this stuff. And after they talk, they arrange a test together of one of these people that is purported to have these abilities. Dr. Powell hasn't met this person before. This person's family, this little girl from Mexico, her family has reached out to Dr. Powell, been like, hey, we know that you study this and we think our daughter has telepathy. We've already entered crazy territory just on that alone. But Dr. Powell's like, Kai, the family, let's all do a little test together. So they go in some place that Kai rents out in southern Los Angeles or Southern California to do this test. And there's a lot more drama and build up to it. If you listen to the podcast, spoilers, this child has telepathy is the result of the test. The girl and her mother are separated by some physical space, and the mother is shown something, and then the child can communicate it. They have these little boards that have letters on it, and the child points to the board and to spell out a word. And with a bunch of these tests, the girl gets all of the answers right. Every number that her mother is shown that the girl is not shown, like every word, pictures, the girl can guess right all the things her mother has seen that she couldn't have seen. This blows Kai's world right open, which it also, I think, does for the viewer, at least for me, because Kai is so clear that she sets up these experiments in a scientific-esque way, not necessarily a scientific way, but really trying to limit any ways that the daughter could possibly see all the things that the mom is seeing that she's not supposed to know, right? Every time they show the mom a flashcard or a number, they're like, you know, I think they have a little divider so the girl can't see it. They cover up any reflective surfaces.
Yeah.
And so it's like, whoa, what is happening? I think as the viewer,
yeah,
that was my experience. That was how you felt as well.
Yeah, and especially, you know, okay, what's next? If you've said telepathy's real, this is episode 1.
1 of 10.
Episode 1.
Okay, so you're like, we're going somewhere.
Yeah,
things are moving. So Kai is like, at the start is like, I don't believe in any, you know, supernatural stuff, right? And she's like, I'm a kind of a scientific minded person. This is weird, but you know, I gotta have some explanation. This feels crazy. She's not all the way down. She doesn't, I think, she's like, this is crazy. Is there telepathy? She seems a little confused. Then she goes and interviews a different child that Dr. Powell has already done tests with. Akil, that's his name. Akil lives on the East Coast. She goes out there and meets Akil, and he demonstrates like the same kind of abilities. Yeah. Right? His mom sees something, Akil knows it. His mom claims that, you know, she'll go off and do something during the day. She'll go shopping, and Akil will come back and he'll know what she's done, right? They do, these kinds of tricks where it's like show mom a card, show mom like a math problem, and Akil he knows all of it. Even if he's, separated by like a distance, even if he's facing the opposite like direction. So he couldn't possibly
They
see.
put them in different rooms at one point.
Okay. All this. And he does it like right every time.
Yeah.
Not random guessing. And then I think the kind of at the end of these tests, the audience surrogate a little bit is Kai's assistant, like videographer guy. And she gets a little interview with him and he's like, I don't know what to believe anymore, man. Is there a God? This is supernatural.
Yeah.
And listener, you're hearing me go through this kind of fast because I want to talk about how crazy it is. But if you listen to it, you're like on this guy's side a little bit. You're like,
yeah,
what is happening? What is going on? Because the things that they claim are like actually just impossible, right? That he couldn't be Akil. This like young guy can't be getting all these answers right without knowing them somehow. But there's no way he could have known them in all the tests they describe.
Yeah.
So
mind blown.
Total mind blown. So now like Kai's kind of kicked down the door. She's like all the way in. Now she's like telepathy. Humans are capable of telepathy, and it seems to be present in nonverbal autistic people. Although Akil, he's kind of a young guy, he can speak some. Mm-hmm. So he's a little different. So something about these autistic people have this supernatural ability. And she's like, I got to know more about this world because it's real, because telepathy is real. I don't know how to communicate how crazy, because I feel like I'm saying it out loud, but it feels so, it feels like we're talking about an audio drama here.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like that. It like she's presenting you with like, no, in the real world, in the real actual world, this is how it works.
Yeah. In some ways, it feels very difficult to figure out how to talk about it because the words you're going to use are going to be very different depending on if you believe it is true or if you don't.
Yeah.
So even just in that sense, it's hard to be like, okay, do I talk about this like it's fantasy because it feels like fantasy?
Yes.
Or do we talk about it like the scientific, particular, painstaking methods that they describe it as?
Right. Because that's through the whole podcast, Kai is really trying to give it a scientific framework, right? Especially at the beginning is trying to understand it through some like scientific language, like not really some like current scientific process. She's not like super trying to compare it to like, is it magnetism or whatever? I think there's like a brief mentioning of like, is it radio waves? But she's trying to speak about it in this real world way because she believes it's real. Yeah. And if you take all of her words at face value at this point, I think if you believe Kai Dickens, it's real. It's absolutely real. I mean, what else? She's lined out these situations where you're like, there is no, there's some other force in the world that we don't understand or that I don't know about that these people can use or that is communicating this information somehow.
Yeah. I'm trying not to jump the gun too much.
Dude, I don't know where the gun is at this point.
I don't know where it is either.
We're in uncharted waters. We are in a whirlpool of questions, confusions, and face palms.
Yeah, because the other thing about this is it is so recent that this podcast has come out. It is incredibly recent. So because I'm like, okay, I want to hear other people go meet these individuals and do these same tests because I mean that's science is replicating results. But that just hasn't happened yet. So you just have to make your own, like, you just have to decide to a certain extent, because you've got this one, like, sure, they talk to multiple people, there's multiple tests that they do, but this one point of view from Kai Dickens is the one point of data that you have to work with as a listener to this, because season 2, there's apparently a season 2, it hasn't come out yet. Like, any number of, because it's gotten so popular, any number of other people could do things jumping off of this to be like, is this real, is it not?
Absolutely.
And it just hasn't happened yet.
Really kind of a sneak preview of the rest of the podcast is Kai doing some more experiments, confirming for herself repeatedly that telepathy is real, and then exploring how that's possible and what other things are possible. Like, that's the rest of the podcast.
Yeah.
And you're right that it's so recent. So the first episode comes out in September. The last episode's like December 24th.
Yep.
2024, right? So we are like a month out, a little more.
They're actively releasing like bonus episodes, which I did not listen to. I listened to the main season 1. But, like, there's actively stuff still coming out. It is, like a month since season 1 ended. Like, nothing can be set up that quickly to release, to comment really thoroughly on it.
Right. So that's so true. Like, the only person who has had time to make a narrative in response to the telepathy tapes is Kai Dickens.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
At least I didn't find anything else that was super detailed. You know what I mean? Going point by point. I found lots of people skeptical.
Yes,
I found lots of people being like, that's not real. I did read some rebuttals online that were interesting. So there's a rebuttal posted on McGill's website. McGill is a university in Canada. And this academic posts this rebuttal. They have this whole like part of their site, which is about, kind of trying to discredit pseudoscience. Anyway, so this guy posts this rebuttal against the telepathy tapes, and he points out a bunch of things that the telepathy tapes doesn't really include, some like wider context from the world of like nonverbal autistic people and all this stuff that Kai is talking about, but that most people don't have the context for. But even like you're saying, this guy he's not like, I went and saw the dude.
Yeah.
And I talked to the dude and I proved it.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's just listened to it and then brought up some stuff. I do want to talk about some of the things that got brought up in this McGill rebuttal. And then I guess at some point we'll get back to the podcast, because this is the thing. I started listening to this and I was like, I have to go see what other people are saying, because it feels so crazy. I think that's the word of the day. It's the word of this podcast, certainly.
Yeah.
In this rebuttal, they talk about a few things. One, they talked about Dr. Diane Powell. Dr. Diane Powell was a psychiatrist in Oregon or Washington, and at one point she had her license suspended by the board in that state. The podcast claims that her license was suspended because she published a book about telepathy in nonverbal autistic children, and then after the board reviewed this book and realized that the evidence was true, they reinstated her license. That is not accurate. Even Dr. Powell made a post about it. It was like, I told Kai Dickens, that is not the reason why I got my license returned to me. So there's kind of dueling narrative here, but what it sounds like is Dr. Powell did release a book about telepathy, but also was accused of not taking care of one of her patients, or that wasn't, maybe it wasn't her patient at the time. It was a very kind of this messy situation in which this person was kind of having a break, and somebody filed a complaint, and the board suspended her license for a while. They thought she hadn't done something right. And then after a while, Dr. Powell says, after a bunch of her patients and colleagues wrote into the board being like, Dr. Diane Powell is really cool and is actually a good physician, the board gave her back her license. Anyway, she is since retired. She's no longer a psychiatrist, so that she can pursue this research and not have to deal with the like public repercussions of that, not have to go through this kind of traumatic experience of losing her license and getting it back or whatever that fight would look like. So that's one thing. It pulls Dr. Powell's credentials into question, which is why it's brought up in the rebuttal. Dr. Powell is kind of the gateway for Kai into this world. Another thing that's brought up that I liked about this rebuttal that was not very explained very well in the telepathy tapes. So I said earlier that this Mexican girl had a board that had letters on it, and she would point to the letters. There's several different methods to try to help nonverbal kids communicate.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of different ones. I don't really understand them all, but I know that one of them involves this board. There's a few different techniques of working with the board, and one of them is for the parent to hold the board, and then they're just supposed to hold it, and then the child can move their finger to point to it. So one kind of like accusation, I guess, levied against this technique is that it can work a little like a Ouija board, right? Where if people put their hands on like a Ouija board or the little glass, you ever done this? Because I don't actually know how it works. Great. The like subconscious motor movement of people can shift it to different locations to spell out words, and the same thing can happen for a spelling partner, the person who's holding this board. They can move the board subconsciously to get the person to spell what they want them to, or like subconsciously want or think that they should, unintentionally. So it has been kind of discredited as this is not actually a good form of communication because it's unreliable. We don't know if the person's communicating or if the partner who's holding the board's communicating. And a similar kind of thing is leveled against a different technique, which is having someone use the board and spell, but the person's wrist is held, is supported by another person. And that's the same kind of idea of like, well, you can just move their finger around, And so that's historically why these techniques have been not endorsed by professionals in that field. And so that's brought up in this rebuttal, which is context you don't really understand from the podcast.
No.
Later, Kai talks about these kinds of things, but without this context, you're just like, yeah, people are being really mean. Why don't they just let these kids spell with their boards? You don't get this full context of
it is brought up. Like, all of that is explained at a point in the podcast, but it's fairly late. I believe it's episode 8 that focuses on all of those sort of ideas, but you're already in it by that point.
Yes, it's late, and I don't think she gives it. She doesn't ever pretend like that is a possibility.
Yeah.
So there is some people that have, like this rebuttal, that have been like, this is super crazy. It's not true. If you listen to this podcast and you want to kind of get the skeptic perspective, which is not Kai's perspective, go read the McGill rebuttal. And then, I've seen some other people talk about it online in a kind of a skeptical way who have been like, so she posts some videos.
Yeah.
And some people have watched the videos and been like, no, it doesn't seem like anything crazy. They do say about Akil, I don't really understand what's going on with his. But the other ones, they're like, I'm pretty sure this is the Ouija board phenomenon.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, particularly because we kind of touched on it, but Akil has the capability to do these things from completely separate spaces. So they are sometimes in completely separate rooms. And because he is semi-verbal, and so there is no letterboard or anything for some of these tests where he just says it.
Yeah, so he doesn't use a letterboard. He uses like an iPad or whatever and types on his own without being supported. So
which, to be fair, that is just an explaining more of this letterboard method. That's part of what they talk about, is that a lot of the time it starts with the wrist being supported, and then they can progress to where they're not being supported anymore. So it's not entirely... it's hard to figure out what.
Yeah, it's not so cut and dry. That's a good thing to point out, is that some people do this technique, but they don't hold the wrist. They just lay a finger on their shoulder, which there's also been complaints against, like, well, you could apply pressure to them to get them to know what you like and don't like.
Yeah, it does get into a pretty, like, okay, are we for real about that? But also, there's just merits to both the believing side and the skeptical side that it makes it very difficult to figure out what to believe, especially, again, because we're so early after the release of this podcast. It can
sound like we're getting sidetracked, but I wanted to talk about kind of the people who don't believe, because at this point in the podcast, I was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Because it feels...
The podcast itself does jump right into... It is giving the believing perspective. There's a little bit of the skeptical perspective, but for the most part, not brought up or dived into.
My big takeaway from this podcast is, to me, what's more crazy than the claims presented in the podcast is that it's so believable.
Yes.
Because I know listener, it may sound like your dear pal Sam and Honor have gone off the deep end.
Maybe we have.
But if you listen to the podcast, that's what is so shocking to me, more than anything else. I will hear, crazy people talk about putting chemicals in the water that turn the frogs gay. Like, I'm used to it. You know what I mean? To quote Alex Jones. Or microchips in your vaccines or whatever. Like, whatever. I've grown up in the 21st century. I'm numb to that.
Yeah.
Okay? Not even worried. But to have someone so kind of intimately, podcasting is an intimate medium, intimately explain and present this evidence to something that I, out of hand, dismissed previously, it's convincing. And Kai Dickens, God bless her, does a great job at providing her point and being like, here's the evidence, and here's what I think, and here's what's going on. So that's why, we just started, but we have to talk about how crazy this is.
Yeah.
And like, is it real? Other people say no. Go on Twitter. Lots of people say yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So let's kind of finish going through the podcast. Kai then goes down to Georgia and meets this community of nonverbal autistic kids, also known as spellers. Sometimes they refer to these kids as spellers because of their use of the board, and they'll spell out words. So sometimes they'll talk about them. They'll say nonverbal autistic people, spellers.
Non-speakers.
Non-speakers, thank you. That is, I think, Kai's word of choice.
Yeah.
She goes down to Georgia, meets this community down there, meets this mother who's this very large proponent of it, talks about her experience with her son, who she really struggled raising him because of his autism. She talks about how he would like run through the house naked. He was very hard to like take him places. She couldn't communicate with him. And that's her son. And, this is a really hard experience. She was like, I couldn't go hang out with people. I couldn't do things because I have to take care of my son, because I couldn't leave him home by himself. And then she talks about how she had kind of this miraculous experience where one day, did he come and speak to her? Or did he spell to her? Do you remember?
He spoke to her, I believe.
Spoke out loud to her.
Yeah. It was the first time he ever did.
I think he said, "I love you, Mom." And she was like, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I believe that she was like, felt that she had like dismissed her son.
Yeah.
Almost as not a person, almost as not conscious.
Yeah.
And then she was like, there's like a consciousness in there.
That is something they talk about a lot, is presuming competency or not.
Kai loves that phrase.
Yeah.
Loves it.
Yeah. Which is, if there's any point that they do have, is that there's clear signs that these kids are competent in ways that normally just entirely they're dismissed as like that kid isn't even in there. But
right,
there are things that, if nothing else, once the parents and the people around them start believing these kids are competent and are able to do things and are able to make art or to learn math or whatever the thing is, then like that is a good thing. Honestly, that's the thing I took away most from it, is this sort of idea that they talk about, and they do talk about it in a way that is like meaningful, but it kind of in other ways feels skipped over because they're then going to the next step of they have supernatural abilities.
Sure.
But that's the thing that feels really impactful to me more about this is let's presume these kids have competency.
Yes. Well, so to stop on that for a second, because I am skeptical of this whole podcast.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that more in the end, but because I'm skeptical, this phrase, presume competence, Kai loves to use this phrase over and over to be like, well, the world has kind of assumed that these kids are, these kids and adults are unable to communicate, therefore they're not intelligent, and in kind of an icky way, like not human, that feels bad. But this phrase, presume competence, is to me, amazing rhetorical tool because it reframes the whole thing as if you don't, subscribe to this way of these methods for spelling, you don't believe in autistic people. Like you like don't believe in this child. You actually are not. In extremely, like you hate them. Like what? Why don't you treat this person?
Yes.
Like because of course they have this rich internal life, but because I'm skeptical of the whole show, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if these people have supernatural abilities. I don't know if this spelling tactic is real. I presume competence. I don't think we should treat anyone badly or inhumanely, but it also is there just a rhetorical tool? Is it just a way of reframing this whole discussion?
I think you're absolutely right in that there are a lot of well-utilized rhetorical tools like that, which is part of what makes this feel like such thorough, convincing investigative journalism,
absolutely.
Is because they are very good at persuasive speaking and these analogies and these comparisons that make things feel more believable and more understandable and that reframe things to where it's like, well, of course believe in these kids because that's the thing that feels good.
Yeah.
But it puts this idea in the middle of sort of hanging between these 2 points of either not believing anything in this podcast or believing all of it entirely in a way that, like, my goal here is to not come to any particular conclusion about this is true or this isn't because I don't feel qualified in a bit. But I think if you consider the possibilities of both sides, if you're looking at it from the perspective that this is not true and there's some ulterior motive and not taking this at face value, it feels like a very slimy, underhanded use of almost pity or any of those kinds of things, like using that as a talking point for this whole thing.
I think it's honestly more like we in the modern day love you're actually wrong about these 5 things. You know what I mean? This this thing you thought you knew, you didn't. I mean, there's a podcast called You're Wrong About that we'll talk about one day.
Yeah.
And I think that's, to me, what it really sounds like is it's like, but you haven't actually thought this all the way through. You're actually, the way you've thought about this is wrong. And so if you adopt this perspective, you'll be right as compared to other people who are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's more to, instead of pity, it's like, I don't even know. It's a wild thing because you almost have to evaluate every statement in 2 possibilities.
Yes.
Everything she says, you're like, okay, I have to think, conceptualize both that. What does this statement mean if everything she said is right, and what does this statement mean if this is totally fabricated?
Exactly.
Which
you have to think about everything twice.
A crazy experience to have. I'm squishing my face out of madness, frankly.
Yeah.
So, just to get back to the story, she goes down to Georgia. She meets this mom, her son. They do tests. She meets this other mom, her son. They do tests. They can read minds. And so, we're past the testing point.
Yeah.
Kai's like, my worldview is shattered. What's going on? Like what are the parts of this worldview? And these women, these mothers are like, cool, we're glad that you're interested because we've kind of developed a little cosmology, like a little explanation of how this works or some thoughts on it. And one of the things that comes up is this concept of the hill.
Yeah.
The hill. The hill, as the mothers are told by their sons, who tell Kai, the hill is a place where these sons go, like they'll go in their rooms, they'll like close their eyes, and they'll be transported to this like alternate dimension a little bit. This like mental space is how I imagine it, which is where all the telepathic people of the world, they go and hang out there. You know, it's like the YMCA for magic kids.
Yeah.
And they go and they talk to people from, you know, Singapore and South Dakota.
Yeah.
Far reaches of the realms. And they all communicate in this kind of psychic hub, which of course is a big development for Kai and for the listener. Crazy. So Kai learns a bunch of stuff from these people. Then she starts talking to teachers. She talks to a bunch of teachers that have taught nonverbal autistic kids, and unsurprisingly talks to the ones that are like, yes, they do have mind powers. I felt it, you know? And then she talks to all of them, collects all their stories about like, I remember I came in with some snacks, or no, I forgot the snacks in the car, but the little boy, he knew that I brought him his favorite snacks. He's like, where are my snacks?
Yeah.
One that was like, had been advocating this stuff since like the 80s, that children could read minds. So she gets all their testimony. Then she moves on to scientists to kind of explain how could this be possible. So she talks to these scientists who kind of believe in this stuff. And they basically say, you know, we need to reject materialism. Now, listener, you probably haven't thought of materialism other than in the way like, I shouldn't be a consumer. It's bad to buy.
Yeah.
But materialism is the like modern scientific worldview that all properties of things happen because of like matter energy, like observable phenomena.
Yes.
Right?
Physically.
Like everything like stacks on top of real observable physical phenomenon. Right? Biology, everything else, you know, it's because of things that are like matter and that we can observe.
Yeah.
But Kai talks to this like cadre of scientists who are like, that's not real. Or at least it's an outdated theory. We need a new theory that involves psychic phenomenon.
Yeah.
And she talks to them about why do they think that. And I remember this one guy who was like, we've observed like psychic phenomenon is real. Like we just know, like we've done these experiments. I think they call them like Geisman experiments. Starts with a G. Google it, listener. And he's like, we performed these experiments where these people are blindfolded and put in like buildings like miles away, and then one of them is like given a red dot or whatever, and the other one has to like guess where it is, something like that. You don't like my description of this?
No, I don't think that's it at all.
Well, a person who is far away from another person is given information, and the other person who is very far away, who has not been given the information, must divulge it.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Like what one might assume would be telepathy.
Yeah.
Right? And he's like, this is real. And we've proven that it happens, that the answerer can give the answers at a higher rate than random chance, right?
Yeah.
So there is some sort of psychic link between person A and person B, because person B gets the information from person A, right?
Yeah.
Side note on that, I did look it up. The Wikipedia page is like, it's widely considered pseudoscience. The results are not that good, and there's a bunch of different problems like that people have been like, here are all these problems with this kind of experiment. Like it doesn't, you didn't account for these things that could cause these errors, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, they talk about I don't even know how to form my thoughts right now.
It's crazy. There's crazy stuff happening.
So Kai adopts this worldview that materialism is wrong. It doesn't account for whatever.
It does. I will point out they're not saying, this is part of what makes it convincing, is that they say all science that is proven by materialism, it's not that that is wrong. That all still remains true, but
Sure.
that there is a deeper underlying further area of science or area of phenomena that exists that isn't explained by materialism, and we need to accept that there's something past that.
Right. Like there's the reality we understand with materialism is like a subset
Yes.
of what the greater reality is.
Yeah.
And we need some sort of theory to explain that.
There's a bigger Russian nesting doll.
Yes. So we've gone from can this little girl read numbers or sort popsicle sticks in the first experiment to modern science is fundamentally incorrect.
Yeah.
It's crazy. The rest of the show is also crazy, but it's most of a blur to me. They talk about other gifts of people. There's a girl who supposedly has precognition. She sees things before they happen.
Mm-hmm.
Then they talk about gatekeepers, why people don't want these children to spell. Most schools won't teach these techniques, these spelling techniques, because they're not endorsed by the national organizations that like govern, how do you teach, special needs kids like this. And so Kai's like, these people are gatekeeping how humans can communicate, and that's wrong. That's bad, and they shouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of speculates, I think, is like, why would they do that? The details almost aren't worth covering, because also, at this point, I didn't really care. You know what I mean? You're just so far in the deep end that you are underwater. Like, it doesn't matter what new, like, pool toys are out there. I don't care. I'm here. Like,
I'm in the water.
And then, second to last episode talks about one of the boys that she met in Georgia. That boy, his name was John Paul. He was a young guy, like 17 or 18, I forget. And John Paul tragically and suddenly drowned in a pool or a hot tub.
In a hot tub.
It's very sad. Then we hear from his mom. And basically we get this kind of explanation of his death, kind of a justification and a grieving of his death in the frame of this kind of supernatural world that he inhabited, quote unquote. We hear from other spellers' parents that, my kid told me something was happening, that, something was going to happen to John Paul. They knew it. People are on the Hill talking about it.
Yeah.
This seemed to affect you particularly. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Which I will say for context that they had already spoken in previous episodes in the realm of other abilities that these children have, that they can see spirits or ghosts or otherwise have communicated with people who have passed on.
Died. I forgot about that, but that's true.
Yes. So it has been brought up before. Then this event occurs and they talk about other kids with telepathic abilities who told their parents before their parents knew that John Paul had passed away. Things like that. It is a very difficult point to talk about and to analyze, as far as the way you view this death becomes radically different depending on, like we said, this double way you have to consider every statement said in this podcast through the perspective of think about it as if it is true and accurate, and then think about it again as if it is not. And this, Sam's right, this episode in particular affected me because I was considering what is the perspective if all of the claims they're making in this podcast are not true, because in this episode they're talking about John Paul knowing beforehand. They talk about these other kids knowing beforehand, and in some ways it's sweet because they talk about, his energy is still with us. He wasn't afraid to go these different things, but it becomes very different if you think about the possibility that that's not true and that these things are being fabricated surrounding this death.
Yeah.
And it's in a very... It is happy. It's like, oh, he was okay with it.
Yes.
It just feels much more somewhere in the realm of careless to twisted, and intentionally harmful, potentially.
Right. Like, it's actually...
because of the framing of this.
In the most negative light, you can view it as these people saying, it's actually good that your son died, right? And that's
it's a very
such
strange...
a grim way to say it, but that's not how it's intended, clearly.
No, it isn't.
But, but people do this, even if they don't believe in supernatural abilities. I mean, there's this kind... Death makes people weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, when someone dies, there's kind of all kinds of talks about what they would have wanted, where they are now, how actually this is okay. And that's part of grieving, right?
Yeah.
There are people who, kind of spiritual people, not to offend anyone, but that would be like, someone died, but I felt them go, or I felt some sort of something, their presence or whatever. I knew that they were just at peace. And people grieve weird, and that's really what it... Honestly, in some sense, that felt familiar to me.
Yes, certainly.
I still really dislike it when someone does that. I was like, I've seen this before in a different light.
Absolutely.
And like I say, it's a part of grief, but I think they were just like, there's some wider spiritual reason that this happened that makes it different from anything else.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's wild. It's heavy. They talk about John Paul's girlfriend, who's also a non-speaker, and which echoes a lot of the sentiment that we kind of mentioned earlier. It's weird. It's a crazy episode. Then the next episode, which is the last one, they talk about, well, they don't really talk about much. They have non-speakers. Someone reads off something they've written, or they have a speech-to-text like program that does it. And so it's, you're supposed to hear directly from them. And that's the 10 episodes, and it's done. And that is season 1.
Yeah.
Of supposedly more seasons of the Telepathy Tapes.
Which makes me wonder, what is season 2?
I think she said she wants to explore more. They also have the talk tracks, something like that, where they just kind of like conversing about this, which are the bonus episodes you mentioned earlier. So, crazy stuff has happened, right? I think there's so much to think about and so much I want to talk about with the Telepathy Tapes. I mean, basically this entire episode, you've seen me just have my hands on my head.
Yeah.
And kind of like...
Your hair is truly looking crazy.
Yeah, I'm kind of going for a little like mad scientist vibes.
Yeah.
So, like I said, this podcast is really convincing. It's like, great job. They took up like a public speaking class and they employed those tools really well.
Yeah.
It's wild. I think listening to this podcast, well, as I thought on it more and kind of sat with having completed the podcast, I kind of came to this conclusion or this thought that the Telepathy Tapes truly reminds me of a religious text. The Telepathy Tapes has in it many supernatural happenings.
Yep.
Which can truly only be explained, because they're just supernatural, through its lens that it provides.
Yes.
And it also asks the audience for belief, right?
Yeah.
We talked about this concept of presuming competence, which is in some say just a way of saying believe, have faith. But they also talk about how, like, literally, some of these kids' powers don't work if you don't believe in them.
Yes.
kind of this, what to me feels like mushy gushy, like modern, like what might be the moral of a Harry Potter novel, So that's what it reminded me of. It felt like if you had read the Bible front to back, or another religious text, if you had read the Quran front to back, I think it would be really hard to not believe it without like wanting to not believe it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Without being like just flatly rejecting it, right? Which frankly, that's where I'm at. I don't want it to be real, and so I'm just rejecting it. I haven't gotten a whole lot of evidence to the contrary, other than people just being like, "That's not possible."
Yeah.
And so that's really what I think this is. In some sense, I would be fascinated to see in like 15, 20 years if this is a religion.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I'm at right now is I think it's entirely fair and reasonable to say that everyone's stance on this is kind of just going to be where you decide to be in this moment. Again, because it's extremely recent.
Yeah.
I don't see how there's not going to be more attempts at tests or meeting these people who are on the podcast or whatever in the upcoming future. Like, that's what's going to happen. And we don't have that yet. So, at least for me, I'm sort of suspending, like, intentionally not deciding anything.
I've decided.
Which is maybe the opposite.
I decided in this moment.
I think maybe the truer opposite than, like, deciding you believe it or deciding you don't is whether you're deciding to take a stance on it or not.
Well, okay.
At this point, because you have the evidence that they gave you, and there's extremely convincing stuff, and there's also holes in it, and also it's so recent that no one else has said anything truly
concrete.
Yeah.
In
no response,
proved it to you that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But so the reason I've come down strongly on the it doesn't exist side is because I'm a person.
Yeah.
Right? I'm a person, and I have to, like, I get knowledge via what other people have found out.
Yeah.
I have to read a book. I have to, listen to an expert. And we've kind of, as a species, developed this process that we call science to figure out answers. And until somebody that I believe, until someone with some authority who's like, I am an expert in these things, tells me, checks out. It's an observed phenomenon, and we're gonna find an explanation to it. I can't. It's too world shattering to believe, because I feel like if I operated in that way where I was like, if someone tells me really convincing, I'll believe them. Which, I mean, that's how humans work. But
yeah,
if I operated in that way, then I'm in every conspiracy theory. Something that really opened my eyes or like made me just go, oh my gosh, what is happening? Was when I was on the Telepathy Tapes Twitter, and there was someone in the comments who was like, thank you for fighting the good fight and spreading this important information. The UFO community has been silenced for decades, and now people are finally seeing the truth with that like modern like experts are suppressing information, right? And I was like, oh. And then Telepathy Tapes was like, thanks for sharing this message of support. Which is like, I see. Okay, they're not like, oh, we're different from UFO people. They're like, that could also be real. I mean, it's just like how every other conspiracy theory or like fringe ideas is a gateway to another one. You know what I mean? It's not that far from going from like some guy on a grassy knoll shot JFK to believing that the earth is hollow. I mean, I know it is many logical steps, but once you are ready to be like, the way I get information is wrong, that people are suppressing information, or that important things are hidden from the general consciousness, or like, common knowledge, then you're ready. Like you can go down any rabbit hole at that point.
Yeah. I think it is an extremely interesting piece to consider as far as an example of like, I would just say human communication, because there's a
Sure.
lot of points at which I was sitting there trying to consider, okay, this is what they're presenting as evidence. Which I haven't paid to see the videos, but there's hypothetically videos that they could show. Hypothetically, they could be faking these things, they could be editing them, they could be staging them, but also it was just an interesting sort of thought experiment for me personally to think, okay, like, what is, because there's a line somewhere that everyone has between things that you'll be shown and you'll say, okay, but I don't believe that because
Sure.
it could be faked, it could be a lie, it could be misguided or whatever. And then there's a line where eventually you go far enough into enough evidence, which is, because unless we all go individually in person, see these things happen, there's going to be a point of communication at which someone will have to give you that information for any phenomena, and then you have to accept it. So it was extremely interesting to me to think about what level of, like, how
many people have to tell you this thing is real before you believe
how many
them?
people have to tell you before you believe them? How much, if it's only one person telling you, how much evidence do they have to provide? Does it have to be because they have audio? Does it have to be the video? Does it have to be something else? Like, what is the line, or what is the configuration of what makes a thing believable? Because at the end of the day, you're right, everything we believe comes from either things that we see, or far more often things that we're told by other people, which means there is a potential point of breakdown between someone has to see thing and, you know,
like, so interpret it for themselves,
and then have to be able to convey it to you in a way that is accurate and where there's no breakdown. It's just an extremely interesting consideration of the process of communication, and then to what we as humans decide to internalize as fact, and what is that process like.
I do want to talk about quickly something that you touched on there, is that there are videos. I think we mentioned this briefly before. So you can go on the Telepathy Tapes website, and there are videos there, because Kai Dickens is trying to make a documentary. She's a documentarian. So she's actively raising money for her documentary. So she'll ask for your support there. And if you pay $10 or $10 a month or something like that, you can get access to these videos. There's not very many. I thought she was going to post like all of the footage from all of her tests. There's like, I think 12 or something, somewhere around there, videos you can watch that are supposed to be short videos from the tests. So that's out there. It's behind a paywall. I know some of our like pessimistic listeners will be like, okay, so this is just a money grift this whole time, right?
It's definitely a consideration.
Maybe. I don't know, but
it becomes different when there's money involved or when there isn't, for sure, is all I'm saying.
Yes.
It's another piece in this weird puzzle of information.
If she was trying to start a religion, why, you know what I mean? Why are we talking about cash at all, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But, I mean, like, if she really believed it, why ask for money for a documentary? Why not just put it up on YouTube and be like, it's real?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't know, dude. It is just, it's so crazy. Like I said, the craziest thing is that it's so believable.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, I think religion is, probably the closest thing the best analogy I can find. It's
definitely all tied up in it.
Well, because there's also like this like savior part of it too, right? Like there's kind of like, she believes that if like these people are allowed to practice their abilities, that they'll like usher in a new age of humanity.
Yeah, and that does remind me of something that I wanted to touch on, which is like there's a weird dichotomy in the, again, consideration of, okay, what's the perspective if you believe it, and what's the perspective if you don't? The perspective if you believe it is that these kids have supernatural abilities, and that's incredible, and we should celebrate those things. If you don't believe it, then it's another weird, because obviously nonverbal autistic people don't get good rep. They get treated as less than human a lot. They get treated as very othered a lot. And this is in what seems to be an attempt to empower them, can also very easily go into the territory of, again, just in a reverse manner, like they're treated as something so exotic
like
and supernatural and superhuman, which is just the reverse coin of they're not like us, which is then a little potentially slimy and like doesn't quite sit right in certain ways.
It doesn't, because it also, I mean, frankly, it feels like one of the, to me, most convincing and kind of the hardest things about this podcast is the amount of different people they have on.
Yes.
We talked about teachers, we talked about scientists, but there's also a lot of parents. So many parents being like, my child has these abilities. And if you don't think that's real, that's really, that sucks.
Yeah.
You know, because they'll be like, yeah, I heard about it online. And I was like, I wonder if my daughter can do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, wow, if you can, it's just like, I mean, who is the person who's going to be like, going to talk to those parents and be like, actually, your child is just, they're not like superhuman. They just have really big learning difficulties or whatever, right? I mean, that's who would do that? That's like kind of a cruel thing to do to a person. But it's also, in some sense, it feels to me like people. Now, okay, I want to be kind and thoughtful about this. I don't have autism, so if there's anyone listening that has autism, you know, they may not, I don't know, relate to how I feel about this. So write in if you do. But it feels to me like a lot of times, you know, we've, as a society, the United States, where my culture, we've talked about like how bad it is to have autism, right? You know, how people with autism, how their life is so hard, and how, you know, that's really difficult for that person and for their parents, and it's a bad thing. And so I think people kind of want that to actually, because I think a lot of people that don't have autism or are neurotypical or whatever don't really understand how neurodivergent people think, right? Like that's the whole kind of bit. And so I think some people really want that these people we don't understand how they think because they're like very special, because they're like really good at something actually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it is, again, almost this reverse desire to, like, okay, what if instead of, because the way they're treated so often is lesser and other, like, okay, what if we instead go full reverse?
Yes.
That's an inclination, which is a reverse way of being not fair to those individuals.
Yeah. Well, I think more generally, people want things to be the way they are for a reason, for a purpose.
Yeah.
Right? Like
for like a higher reason.
Yeah. Or I mean, like,
of like it all evens out in the end.
Yeah. Like you're tall because you were meant to play basketball.
Yeah.
Right. Or like you're really good at math because you were meant to be an engineer or whatever.
Yes.
Right. And in the same way, you know, there's it just popped into my mind. There's a visual effects studio that employs a lot of people with autism. In some of they do like visual effects cleanup, right? So they generate these visual effects, but they're very noisy. Like there's a lot of stuff that needs to get cleaned up before that they can be shipped out to be used in like a Marvel movie. And so they have these artists and they like to employ people who have autism because they like to just hyper focus. And what it would be really boring to other job applicants, they just like go through and they like erase all these lines and stuff frame by frame, right? And I think this was like a news story, and I think it appeals to people because it's like, aha, actually it's an ability, you know what I mean? Anyway, I worry that it's similar here.
Yeah.
That it's like, you know, this child cannot speak, but there's a reason. The reason is that they have like divine abilities.
Yeah.
You know? That there's some other cosmic force that they've tapped into, which means that they have, in some way, their physical body is neglected.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like a sucky explanation for this whole thing. It's a wish. People are wishing. I mean, Kai Dickens, her brother is autistic. And she talks about that. She doesn't talk about it in the podcast. I found out with another interview with her. And so you could be like, ooh, is this a conflict of interest? Is this I really want it to be this way?
Yeah.
But again, that's like a really sucky thing to say to another person. Like, oh, no, actually, things are bad.
Yeah.
It feels bad,
It's
dude.
weird. Yeah.
I don't like it.
It's weird lines to walk.
Yeah. This is a weird podcast.
Yeah.
It is
It's crazy and weird.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people that really like it.
Mm-hmm.
That are really, really into it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how to feel about this one, Honor.
I feel, again, like it's just so recent. I would not be surprised if we do another episode on the Telepathy Tapes in 6 months, a year. If there's going to be a season 2, and I feel so certain there's going to be tons of fairly in-depth responses to it. Maybe not tons, but like there will be people who will be like, okay, let's go the distance we have to go to have another set of eyes on these things. Because right now it's the Kai Dickens perspective.
Right. I don't know if that's going to happen because, I mean, just imagine all the documentarians or reporters or skeptics, whoever, like knocking on the door of these like parents' houses with, like young adult children. I don't know that.
I mean, if nothing else, then like other people who do want this to be more believed. If it's a debate that's happening right now, then people like to have more information about a thing that everyone's talking about.
Sure.
So I think people from either side will get involved.
Maybe, but I just don't know that the people that...
I don't think people are going to do nothing.
Yeah, I just don't think that the people who will come to those parents and be like, I don't think your child has super abilities, that those parents will be like, yeah, come on in my house.
I think there are people who sit in the middle who are like, I want to know. Like, I don't know what to think. Mm-hmm. And I think those people, will probably be interesting things that happen.
I can't imagine. I don't think I'm going to listen to season 2. There's been so many bombshells. Like, I don't need the New Testament. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing else that Guy Dickens can say that you know what I mean? Mm. I don't know what to rate the Telepathy Tapes. If it was just on entertainment value, engaging at the least,
Yeah.
At that point, if it was just on entertainment, maybe like a 8 out of 10 podcast. Right?
We don't normally rate out of 10.
I just now realized that.
Yeah. So you messed up.
Dang it. But like on how I felt while listening to it, 2 out of 10? 1.9? Wait, no, not 2 out of 10. 2 out of 5?
2 out of 5?
Man, it's got me mixed up. The whole time I felt
this guy doesn't know math anymore because he listened to the Telepathy Tapes.
Oh, that's what I'll do to you kids.
That's a crazy thing to say. That's not true. Yeah, I don't know.
I think that's probably our best conclusion is that we don't know. And that feels weird.
I think more okay with it than you.
Honor, you want to give it a rating?
Gosh, I don't know. It is, in some way, it's definitely, I would say, extremely well articulated, like persuasive work. It's very well put together. There's a lot of technically, like, very well done aspects of it. Yeah. It's well recorded, all of these things. As far as journalism, impossible to rate. I think it's impossible to rate just because it is varies so wildly depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I want to leave it, is that it varies wildly depending on your perspective.
And that's where we'll leave it. Listener, thank you for joining us on this episode. It's been a weird one. We appreciate you being here. Come back next week. No, week after next week. Whenever we post these.
We post bi-weekly.
And we'll be back on our normal stuff. We got to get away from these weird pods. We did Joe Rogan and the Telepathy Tapes.
We have to go back to normal stuff. We have to rate a Dungeons and Dragons podcast.
Please.
Oh my gosh. Normally you tell me no.
We should.
This is crazy.
No, that's a bad. I
yeah,
see it in your eyes.
You've given me a ticket.
Well, listener, email in. Give us any thoughts. Give us some podcast recommendations. If you listen to the Telepathy Tapes, let us know. It's been great talking to you, Honor, because I feel less crazy.
I'm so glad.
Just talking it out loud because I couldn't say this to anyone.
Yeah.
Send us an email. Leave us a review wherever you're listening to this. Give us 5 stars. If you can write a review. We'll read it out. Follow us. You'll hear about when the next one comes out. And that's it.
And we'll see you then.
We'll see you next time. Thank you, Honor, for potting with me.
Thank you, Sam, for potting with me.
Listener, thank you for potting with us.
Yeah.
And we'll see you on the next episode of the Podcast.
Bye. Bye.